And as Russian forces push forward deeper into Ukraine today, capturing the city of Kherson, as we mentioned, and encircling other key strategic cities like Mariupol, we're also getting reports from the battlefield of Russian troops abandoning their vehicles without a fight. In fact, the New York Times put it this way. They're reporting that some Russian soldiers, plagued with poor morale, lack of fuel and food, have, quote, surrendered en masse or sabotaged their own vehicles to avoid fighting. Now, those reports appear to confirm pictures and videos posted online by Ukrainians across the country showing abandoned Russian military hardware. With reliable battlefield information often hard to come by, as you can imagine, by one of the people that has proved most adept at examining this user-generated content and proving context on what we are seeing is Rob Lee. He's an expert on Russian defense policy and Russian military hardware. Lee is a former Marine Corps infantry officer who is also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He joins us now. Rob, thank you so much for being with us. So what's your impression after seeing this New York Times report based on U.S. intel that entire units of Russian troops are abandoning their vehicles, laying down their weapons, rather than fighting in Ukraine? Does that comport with some of the reporting and user-generated content you are able to see online?
Yes, I think it confirms what we're seeing online. In a lot of the videos, many of the Russian soldiers who were surrendering or being captured, a common theme is just saying they didn't know they were going to war. So they were deployed. They thought they were doing a training exercise. It's clear many of them were not told they're going to war until maybe a day or two prior. And so it's really bewildering for them because I don't think many of them know what the purpose of this war is, and maybe has ever seen a task, but they don't know why they're there in many cases. In many cases, the civilian resistance they're seeing is something that's also quite surprising. And so I think in many cases, they're being told to move into Ukraine. The planning isn't that clear. And a lot of times we're seeing abandoned vehicles and vehicles that appear to be in working order, and yet they're still being abandoned in large numbers, which indicates that, this is something that might be deliberate or, there are significant morale issues that basically confirmed by the New York Times report of what we're seeing from open sources.
I'm sure you've seen this, but U.S. officials today, they said that Russia has put a large number of rank-and-file soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, by some estimates as many as 70% of those that were committed along the border, but perhaps with inadequate resources. They are yet to control the airspace over Ukraine entirely. Are you surprised by what we have seen thus far in terms of how Russia is executing this war?
Yes, there are a number of surprising aspects. One thing that I thought was when Russia started this war, I thought they're going to maximally employ their use of fires, of aviation, of airstrikes, all those things to degrade Ukraine's defensive capabilities, to try and knock out the Ukrainian Air Force, to knock out their air defense systems. All of those things I thought they were going to achieve. I thought they were going to use electronic warfare very heavily to knock out communications in Kyiv. And we haven't really seen that. And it's been quite surprising. It appears they're adapting at this point, but it appears that when they went in, that they had overly optimistic goal or idea of what was going to happen. I don't think they thought they're going to get this much resistance. It includes, many of these cities that they've taken so far, moved into, are it should be the more pro-Russian areas or the Russian-speaking areas, and they're still seeing a significant amount of resistance. And so it is, I think, quite surprising to them of what they're seeing. And it's clear that the initial goal was to try to get to Kyiv as quickly as possible with light forces, and they did that air assault operation, an airport outside Kyiv on the first day. That failed. And now they're moving into Plan B. But it's not completely clear to me how they're going to translate military force into achieving long-term political goals. And it seems as though the political goals they have are unrealistic to be achieved through military force.
You also probably saw that Russia today announced that 500 of its soldiers have died in this conflict so far. Two Western officials tell NBC News today that it's probably closer to around 6,000 Russians that have been killed in Ukraine so far. That is a significant number of losses in 1 week. If true, that means more Russian troops have died in Ukraine in 7 days than U.S. troops did in Afghanistan in 20 years, and almost the same number of Russians who died in Chechnya during that war. What do you make of those conflicting reports?
So, even if we accept the Russian figure, right, about 500 KIA and about 1,500 wounded in action, those are unprecedented numbers for the Russian military under Putin's leadership, right? So in Chechnya, Russia lost more than 3,000 soldiers. That was over many, many years, right? It wasn't under such a confined time period. In Georgia, Russia lost fewer than 100 soldiers, and that was over 5 days. In the Donbass in 2014, 2015, Russia probably lost a couple hundred, 200 to 300. And then in Syria, they've only lost a couple hundred over a long-term campaign too. So even if the 500 KIA figure is accurate, that is still substantially more over a short period of time than Russia has suffered at any time these other wars Putin has fought. And if we're talking about 6,000, that really is an astounding figure. And it's again, it comes back to, did Russia expect they would sustain these kind of losses? I'm not sure they did, but if it's on that higher end, that really is significant. And one of the big problems, and one of the things that's unique about this war, is that when you compare it to the Iraq War, the Bush administration had a long, year-long mobilization campaign. They tried to mobilize public support in support of the war. Putin didn't do that this time, right? And they kept denying they were going to war up until a few days prior. And so because the Russian government did not mobilize the public, there's a bit of a question of, if this war drags on and casualties increase, what is the public backlash? And I think that's a real question. I don't really know, but I think over the next few weeks, with the economic disruptions, that could become a significant factor. And I think it's very possible that President Putin will be facing possibly the greatest domestic threat to his time in office in the last 10 years, or maybe his entire time he's been in office.
Rob Lee, former Marine Corps infantry officer and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you so much for your analysis. Greatly appreciate it. Learned a lot.